Hi, this is your buddy Quinn, and welcome to the first of the artist introductory videos in my series, Foundations of British Rock. This is a bit of a mini course, and if you missed it, video number one introduces the course and what this is about. But today, we're going to focus on the most influential and famous of all of the bands of British rock, and indeed, probably the most famous band and certainly the most successful band in the world, and that's the Beatles. It's quite daunting to introduce the Beatles, but this is undoubtedly where this series must begin. There is a good case to be made that there is no band in history that has had more influence globally on the future of music, and not only in the English language, but probably in any language. There's been an enormous amount said about the Beatles, and there is an enormous amount that could be said by way of introduction. But my purpose here is not to cover all that should be said, but just to provide a little bit of context to where this band came from, the way that they ended up shaping much of Anglo-American culture in the 1960s, and then to highlight some specific things to listen out for as you listen to the playlist associated with this introduction. In the process, I hope that to get you excited to visit or to revisit the Beatles and to experience them with new eyes and a fresh perspective. The Beatles were formed in the working class port city of Liverpool. Liverpool is on the central west coast of England, and historically it was quite a well-to-do city. It was a slave port for the British Empire. By the time that the Beatles come along, it's much more of a working class city. As young boys, the people who would form the Beatles were influenced by 1950s, the very earliest attempts at rock and roll. So artists like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Elvis Presley. And this is a band that formed as the Beatles in 1960. They had previously had some experience playing together in secondary school. And the Beatles disbanded in 1970. And so it would be really hard to find more of an iconic representation of the 1960s than the Beatles were. They start in 1960, they end in 1970, and they evolve dramatically over the course of that decade, just as that decade evolves along with them. They were one of the catalysts for that evolution in terms of youth counterculture that developed in the 1960s. And it's really hard to find any musician that came after the Beatles that isn't influenced by them in some way. The Beatles are made up of four members. John Lennon, who is on vocals and also plays rhythm guitar. Paul McCartney on vocals and who plays bass guitar. Ringo Starr on drums, and George Harrison is the lead guitarist. After the 1970s, all four of these artists are going to go on to have successful solo careers, and those that are still with us are still making music to this day. A couple of other characters that were really important in the Beatles' evolution was their really well-known manager. His name was Brian Epstein, and their producer, George Martin. They went a long way from taking a band that had a lot of raw talent and had a lot of fun together and becoming turning the Beatles into a really professionalized group that in just a couple of short years turned them into a remarkable international sensation. Ringo Starr was the last of the four to join the group. He joined with them as a drummer in 1962, around the time that they were releasing their first music for international audiences. John Lennon and Paul McCartney started this up. They first got together really as 16 and 15-year-olds playing in a school band. They later became locally famous in Liverpool, where they played at a venue called the Cavern Club. And there's a great Beatles museum in Liverpool called the Beatles Story that walks you through those early years and what it was like to be playing early music in Liverpool. Lennon and McCartney were probably the driving creative forces of the Beatles. They were both songwriters. They had a lot to do with the lyrical content and quality of the Beatles' music. They also were quite different from each other. They had different musical interests and styles, but combined, they really became what is quite possibly the greatest songwriting partnership in history. It took just 2 years from their first album in 1962 to become massive international stars, which became apparent as they led what became known as the British invasion of the United States. Beatlemania appeared in the United States in the mid-1960s. which for many parents, particularly of young girls, was akin to some kind of irrational psychosis in terms of the emotions that Beatles performances generated. For 4 years, they toured nonstop, from 1962 to 1966. And in that period of time, they had an amazing 1,400 concert appearances. It exhausted them. It really drained them to the point where they just had to break it off. And they stopped touring in 1966 with the last big concert in San Francisco in Candlestick Park. They did, however, continue producing great music, and many of their most important albums come after the touring years. And they produced music for the next 4 years until 1970. The Beatles become introduced to a variety of drugs over the course of their careers. Partly it helped to relieve their stress, but they also were influenced by LSD, which led some of their music to dip into psychedelia. Marijuana becomes an important drug that the band uses at some point during the mid-1960s. And both of those experiences, I think, really spur them to really rapid creative innovation, beginning in their albums about 1965. Also in 1968, near the end of the band's career, they traveled to India to participate in a 3-month meditation program at an ashram, which was led by a Maharishi, an ashram guide, to help them spiritually connect and to meditate. And they took it seriously for some time. They all left earlier than they were supposed to because they became disillusioned with the leader of that ashram. But the experiences they had in India were also a source of creative inspiration and influenced many of their later songs. Both creative and personal tensions within the band, particularly over the different directions that Lennon and McCartney really wanted to take the songs, were ultimately too much to overcome, and the band disbanded in 1970. Lennon and McCartney had very strong solo careers after that. Lennon was assassinated in New York in 1980, so his career was cut short. And Harrison also passed away from lung cancer in 2001. But both Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr are still active. In this short decade, the Beatles produced an amazing 12 studio albums and 22 singles. Most of those singles are not on their studio albums. This is an enormous feat of creative productivity, especially given the touring that they're doing at this time. It's really quite astonishing. And what I find most interesting about this period of time for the Beatles is this evolution that takes place. They start out in the early 1960s. They're doing something different. It's probably what we would think of as turning rock and roll music into a bit more of pop content. Many of the songs are lighthearted. They revolve around young love, and they are really, really influential on youth culture in the United States. The first hit that they had in 1962 is Love Me Do. And their first album comes out in the early 1963. It's called Please Please Me. And that was just a hit generating machine. And for the first 2 or 3 albums for the Beatles, they really are engaging in a new form of pop rock that really resonates with the youth. They go so fast, they tour so much that they start to feel a little bit lost. And early on, in about 1964, they make an album called Help. John Lennon titles or writes the title song for that, called Help, and it really is a bit of a plea for help as they are overwhelmed by the sudden stardom that they're facing and the amount of pressure that they face as a result of that. But that becomes a little bit of a transition, and it sends a signal that they might start doing something quite different. In 1965, they start making what I consider to be really interesting records that go beyond their pop rock roots. A couple of those albums really stand out. Rubber Soul, 1965, is one of my favorites. It has some folk elements to it. Revolver, next year, 1966, is very strong, much more experimental. And then their craziest, most experimental album of all time is in 1967. The title of the album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And as they do that, they almost take on a persona. They get out of their original Beatles persona. It was too much pressure. They imagine themselves as a different band. And this record is really over the top in terms of creativity and musical innovation. It actually took about 700 hours to record it because of all the different things they tried to do on this album. For some rock critics, like Rolling Stone, they rank Sgt. Pepper's as the most influential and greatest album in rock music of all time. I think it's a little bit more difficult to listen to than some of the earlier albums. I personally like Rubber Soul or some of the later albums like Abbey Road or Let It Be, but you have to give the Beatles credit for really pushing the boundaries of the genre with albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. One of the other albums that really stands out is a self-titled album. It's later in their career. It's 1968. It's just called The Beatles, but it's a double album, and it's referred to by most critics as the White Album. It's also very influenced by their time in India and stands out as some of their best work. Here are a few things that I encourage you to listen for as you listen to the playlist. And again, I really hope that you listen to it in chronological order so that you really see the evolution of the Beatles over time. One thing that makes the Beatles special, and that anyone who saw them in live performances could recognize, at least intuitively, is that all four members of this band were deeply genuine individuals. They loved to have fun. They had a great time making music. They joked around. This gives them the flexibility to be constantly experimental. They just love lyrics. They love what they're singing about. And so the pure joy of rock and roll really comes out in the Beatles' music. Because they are so popular, they're enlisted over the 1960s to make a few movies as well. Sometimes they have some creative control of those movies. Other times they don't. I wouldn't say any of those movies are really outstanding, but particularly in the earliest ones, like A Hard Day's Night, you get a sense that this is a group of young men that really, really enjoy being together. As I mentioned, there's also a huge evolution in the course of a single decade. Beatles in 1967 are hardly recognizable to the Beatles in 1962. So that shift from Beatlemania youth culture on the first several albums to much more psychedelic and lyrical quality on the last half of their albums is really very interesting to me. There's also a creative tension, as I mentioned, between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. It is not quite as apparent in the first few albums, but it becomes much more apparent over time. John Lennon has remarkable songs, so some standouts that were written by Lennon that you might want to focus on are Norwegian Wood and In My Life. Both of those are on Rubber Soul. Those are good examples of Lennon. Later on, he's also responsible for more of the psychedelic and experimental tracks. Come Together is another great Lennon composition for the Beatles. Paul McCartney, if anything, was even more prolific as a songwriter. His songs tend to be a little bit more lyrical in content, a little less experimental, but really beautiful songs. I'd recommend songs like Penny Lane, Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Yesterday. Yesterday is the earliest of those. It's on the Help album. The others come much closer to the end of the Beatles. George Harrison also was interested in doing some songwriting. He was their lead guitarist, but he did write some notable songs to a much lesser degree. But one of my favorites of George Harrison, it also is a very lyrical song called While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I hope that you take some of those lyrical songs interesting. My very favorites are probably Hey Jude, Yesterday, Something is another one, and Let It Be, as I mentioned. Most of those are written by McCartney. There's also some very interesting psychedelia beginning in 1968. Strawberry Fields Forever is a Lennon song on the album Magical Mystery Tour. A Day in the Life on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is sometimes considered to be the most important of all the Beatles songs. It's long, it's incredibly experimental. Both Lennon and McCartney end up taking a turn in writing that. I think Lennon starts it out, but this song is probably not as beautiful immediately for audiences or as catchy, but it's really a stunning song. And so when you get to the section of the playlist where we see Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, pay particular attention to the song A Day in the Life. Also Yellow Submarine, really playful, song influenced by psychedelia. That's on the album Revolver. The Beatles were essential in the United States and in Britain to what becomes known in the 1960s as a counterculture. Part of it has to do with statements about existing social norms. The Beatles write a song called Revolution that's extremely popular. And to their credit, in the next album, on the White Album, they write another version of that song called Revolution 1, which is a very different take using the same lyrics. They're also sensitive to some of the follies of politics and the Cold War. Back in the USSR is an important Beatles song, which borrows and transforms lines from the Beach Boys song, California Girls. So the Beach Boys, very, very popular in creating a bit of a beach culture in the United States. Beatles reflected that and really transformed it into much more of a counterculture kind of song. They were also influenced by Bob Dylan and the folk revival movement in the United States, and Bob Dylan and the Beatles in many ways were rivals in the 1960s. Beatles had stunning impact. They transformed youth culture in the Anglo-American world. They made rock overwhelmingly popular and injected elements of what we would now consider pop music into their early rock. The Beatles also, from a musical perspective, really changed the way that songs were written. They took songwriting much more seriously. They also were really experimental as they did it. Some of their songs are extremely playful. Some of them are much more serious. They also transformed the way songs were recorded, trying different recording techniques. They really pioneered arena rock concerts in the United States that set the stage for other big rock bands to go out and make a lot of money in very, very big arenas. And the way that they smiled and played and joked resonated with people on stage, and they were one of the great touring bands of all time. If you're interested in further thoughts on the Beatles, you could always watch one of the early Beatles movies, like A Hard Day's Night. That's a 1964 movie. I don't think it's a great movie, but it is a lot of fun, gives you a sense of what the Beatles were like in the early days of their career. Probably a better resource is Ron Howard's documentary on the Beatles. It's called 8 Days a Week, The Touring Years. And it focuses on the first half of the Beatles' career. And that's a 2016 documentary that I'd highly recommend. I hope you'll now turn to the Beatles playlist. Again, the link to access that playlist on Spotify is provided in the notes on this video. Playlist is about 3 hours long. Welcome to the Beatles.